Your whole screen is displaying.
How's it look now?
Looking good.
Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. We'll give it, well, we're already 1 minute past. Okay, I'm Rich. Sitting next to me is co-chair Daryl. I'll be running the slides, which means, for those of you who haven't done it, I don't have access to the Meetup UI. Otherwise, you get that funky little picture thing you saw a second ago. I am also on the Jabber client, and I'll have my audio on. So I'll run through the first set of slides, and then I'll be presenting the others. So if you're speaking, just say next slide, and I'll hit the down arrow. Welcome to the IETF 110. One thing a couple of us have noticed is it used to be Friday afternoon was like the worst slot because people were always getting ready to go on planes. I remember chairing an Acme meeting where I literally had the suitcase right at my desk, and as soon as the meeting was done, ran out. Virtual, it seems much less of a penalty to meet on Friday afternoon. So let's get started. Welcome to HTTP-API, our second meeting. If you've been to the IETF before, you've seen this, the note well. If this is your first IETF and you've been around for the week, you've seen it and you're already sick and tired of it. Basically, it says we have processes, we have procedures, we record the meetings. When you signed in to join the meeting via the Meetup, your name was written down. Behave politely, maturely, act, don't do anything you'd be embarrassed if it showed up in your local paper. Administrative tasks. So the blue sheets will happen automatically. I can do the Jabber scribe. That means if you're not attending via Meetup and there's something you want to say, just prefix it with the word mic, and it'll get relayed at the mic. Daryl will be handing the cue if you want to speak. During a presentation, generally we wait for questions afterward, although if you have a clarifying question, you can raise your hand. It's on the left side of the UI. But we need two note takers. We use the CodeMD. We can get by with one if we need to, but ideally we have two people that help catch each other up. It's a pretty easy job. You don't have to record everything that was said. This recording will end up on YouTube in the IETF channel. But is there a volunteer to take notes in the on CodeMD? Anyone? All right, I'll have to do it, but not that big a deal. All right, in other administrative things, here is our agenda. We've already done 2/3 of the administrivia. We have a 2-hour meeting time slot. Agenda bashing, IETF term for, does anybody want to suggest changes to the agenda or add things that aren't otherwise here? Just
I
unmute. Yeah.
Yep.
Oh,
okay,
and when
okay,
you
good.
Yep, when you speak, please just say your name for people like me who can't see any pictures or anything like that.
Okay, yes, this is Eric speaking, Eric Wild.
Yeah.
So what I want to say is that the content warning header, which is listed there, I don't think I can say a lot for that because that's mostly Andre who has taken care of that, and I'm not quite sure what the status is there.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
this is Daryl. I added that because it was an open item from last time that we ran out of time. So if we wanted to have that as a conversation at the end, we can do that. Okay.
Okay. So if everyone's fine with the agenda, we'll move to the rate limiting headers discussion, which I guess, Daryl, you were doing?
Yes, and I'm not going to go into any details here, but just as an update on this specification, there has been a number of pull requests based on feedback that's been received on the spec. There has been work around improving the goals of the overall specs, and that link will take you there to the details there. There's also some areas around performance insofar as just providing guidance around telling implementers, hey, this big set of headers, you don't have to return these headers on every single request that is made. You can maybe only return it once a quota is up to a particular level. You can dig into the details there, and there's some conversations around specific throughput. I tried to put more details here initially, but then I realized there would be just way too much stuff, and without the draft editors, I didn't think it would be worth going into too much detail. But all that said, there is active work going on in that spec, and we are closing a bunch of issues.
Okay, anybody have questions? All right.
It's
Eric,
quite the Jabber front.
Cool. All right, Eric, depreciation header.
Yes. Okay. So this is Eric. Nothing much has changed for that header. So the last time we discussed it at IETF 109, I think it was pretty clear that it was simple, that it was useful. What we did in the meantime is we moved the draft to be an official working group header. It's, for those who don't know it, it's very simple. It works in the same way as the sunset header field. So basically what you can do is you can just say this resource is going to be deprecated, or this resource is deprecated. So it's a simple timestamp, basically. Next slide, please. You can just cursor keys, cursor right.
Yep.
Yes, thank you. So the model is really simple. It's just basically saying deprecation is something that is happening or has happened for a resource. The one limitation that is in there and that is still in there is that deprecation is only on the resource level. So there is no mechanism in there to say certain fields or certain methods are deprecated. So it's either the whole resource is deprecated or it's not. This makes the model much simpler, but it also means, of course, that for some needs that people might have where they want to deprecate individual things, this might not be the thing to use. But so far, it seems that most people are okay. We have a list of implementations in the draft, and there is a good list already. If you have already implemented that header field, or you have seen it implemented somewhere and that's not in the list, please let us know. We are happy to add it. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the history now is we've seen 6 versions of the draft being published. There were 4 that were published as individual drafts, and then we had a little publication blip, which meant we had to publish 2 versions very briefly, one after the other. But now there is a stable version. I don't really see, there's no open issues in the repo. I think it was okay when we presented it last time, and there were no issues that were raised in the meantime. We did, I think, a very few, mostly editorial changes. And other than that, I think it's kind of ready to go. I don't really know what the process is, but like I said, if anybody thinks there are things that need to be improved, then I would appreciate to see a comment or to see an issue on the repo. If not, then I think it's kind of ready for a last call.
Okay, I'll say a couple words about the way the process works.
Sure.
We'll, yeah, okay. So we would normally ask, how many people have read the document. We'll, I think, do all of that on the mailing list, unless Daryl feels comfortable doing a show of hands poll. But then we say, okay, we're going to issue a working group last call. That usually lasts a week, maybe two, where we say, is anyone object? And we make sure that their objections have been addressed. They may be, no, you're wrong, or we may actually result in changes to the draft. When we're done with that, it goes to our area director. We have a new area director. It was Barry. The term of office has changed, so we can everybody in the chat wave to Francesca, who is our now responsible AD. After she reviews it, it then goes on to the IESG, which will post it to the IETF wide, and they'll also do reviews. The IESG has to approve it. They can do a discuss vote, which has detailed things that they find wrong or that need to be addressed. It will come back to the working group. Depending on the changes made, we'll either redo last call or send it back up to the IESG. After the IESG and the IETF last call is done, it then gets, okay, we're going to publish it. And at that point, it goes to the RFC publication group. And that takes, a few weeks, and then it's formally published. So that's the process. For the most part, there's basically two more groups of experts who will have a chance to look at the document after the working group says we're ready to release it. So I think what makes sense, Eric, is if you post a note to the mailing list saying you think it's done, you'd like to issue you'd like us to issue a working group last call, which Daryl and or I will do. But first, see if there's any other comments. Give people a chance to comment so that we can just do the call once and be done.
So I just want to add.
Please.
Sorry, go ahead, Eric.
No,
do you want to? I just want to add, just speaking as an individual, I didn't realize that there had been changes made to make it target just the resource, because I believe originally there was text that was inferring that it could be more precise. I know that I'm familiar with implementations that do currently use it to show deprecations within the content. So I'll grab some people who are dependent on that behavior and get them to come comment there, because I think there is interest in being able to have finer grained capabilities. And Alexander is in the queue, so go ahead, Alexander.
Hello, Alexander Mayhofer. I have a process question. Do you guys want reviews of documents as text to the mailing list, or do you want to get pull requests in the repo itself, or both?
We can let Eric. Oh,
I'll mention anything that shows up as an issue or a pull. Anything that shows up as an issue on GitHub will get forwarded via tooling to the mailing list. So if you have a pull, if you want to just make a suggestion, if you want to just make a pull request, it's probably worth making the pull request and then posting a note to the list saying I've done this, and give a link to the PR number or something.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Eric, go ahead.
Just responding to your comment, Daryl. There was language in there that said that it did support deprecations of individual features, but it never said how, which is kind of the tricky part. And because and because of that, and because we did see some people using it for that just resource level deprecation, and our assumption was that if we want to add that mechanism later on, that could be done. It just could be something that later on is being done, maybe in a different spec. But yes, we can definitely discuss that. But it's not that we removed any features, we just removed the language that kind of was not backed up by features in the spec.
Okay, I just missed that. Sorry. Chris, go ahead.
I'm going to go ahead and voice the comment that I made in Jabber chat. But the question I have around this particular ID is what we want clients to do with this information. So the spec tells me a lot about how servers can express intent and how they should format it and what they can tell me, but it's unclear as a client what I'm supposed to ever actually do with that information, especially if I don't have any scoping information to go along with it.
Yeah. Okay. So that is then maybe something that we should add to the draft to put in there. And to be honest, I mean, there's not much that clients can do on a programmatic level. Mostly what clients can do is they can write into log files, alert whoever is responsible for the client, whoever is responsible for maintaining that code, that one of the consumed APIs or one of the consumed resources is going to be out of service or is getting deprecated, that maybe the developers want to see what replacement they can find. So it's more that kind of, it's not a fully automated process, but it's a sign that if you look out for that sign, then you can kind of trigger processes so that things can be adjusted accordingly.
That sort of advice might be useful somewhere. Taking logging actions or notifying users via some sort of an interface are automatic behaviors that clients could actually act on.
Okay, good. I'll write that down and I'll add that as basically as a little note to the draft. Thank you.
And Sanjay, you want to go ahead?
I think Eric answered it. That was what I was thinking, that in the client side, you are not taking any programmatic action, but if you are doing log scraping and you find out that there is something, a sort of a warning there, then you would go and try to migrate to the new version or start preparation for the migration. So I think, yeah, we should, we don't have that client side view in the spec, but that is a good point. I think we can add that.
I will also add that a lot of API developers work with tools like Postman or other kind of developer, I'm just trying out this API, I'm playing around with it, trying to learning experiences, and they generally expose all the HTTP headers. So as somebody is working and learning how to use an API, they will see these kind of response headers appear in developer tooling.
You could even imagine those tools kind of explicitly saying, do you really want to play around with this API? It's deprecated.
Yeah, so it's more of a developer time experience than a runtime experience. Do you want to, Chris, do you want to further elaborate on your comment in the chat about people doing bad things?
Yeah, so, one thing that I definitely wouldn't want someone to do is I wouldn't want someone to see deprecation followed by a successor version link and then have their client automatically start making requests against the successor version as though it were the previous one, because that would be bad for a whole host of reasons. And hopefully people wouldn't do that. But I certainly wouldn't want them to think that they ought to.
That's a good point. We would not hope that they do it, but maybe we should make this more explicit. Thank you.
Okay, Alexander.
Hello. I think that if we look at the specs, we should be very precise on the semantics. And in other working groups, we have had great success with leaving the decision what actually happens mostly to the client, because I mean, people can get all kind of weird ideas, and upgrading automatically to another version of the API would be one. But I think we should make very clear in the draft. Having said that, I haven't read it yet. What the semantics of it are. And if those semantics are precise, then it's much easier for the client to decide on what the action should be.
Okay, so if you get around to reading it, Alexander, that would be great. And then also, if you think that the semantics are clear enough or what's missing, then I think that we can work with that and see whether we need to improve things.
Yeah, I'm certainly going to get and
Chris, go ahead.
Specifically on the semantics, the alternate and successor version and latest version don't have a lot of detail on what the semantics of those are. So, for example, the alternate designates a substitute. It would be nice to know if a client is entitled to assume that they can use that substitute in the exact same way as the current one, and if they do, what parts would need to be substituted. So it's not clear to me exactly what that means. And so specifying exactly what alternate and successor and latest actually mean semantically would allow a client to make informed decisions.
Sanjay?
Probably prove that, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think that was just, it was a good point.
You
It should be more clear, I guess, in terms of using those link relations.
Yeah, we'll try to clarify. I think, the aspect about, what you interpret from it and someone starts using newer version. Typically, when there is serious application involved, there is a process to migrate to a new version of the API. It doesn't happen just because of looking at the response, right? It starts the process. So we can up to a certain point we can clarify, but I think a lot depends on the documentation that the link refers to, and that is provided by the API developer, and we leave that responsibility over there in clarifying those things, right? So we'll try to put client specific context examples, but I think we shouldn't expect a lot of accuracy from the spec on that aspect. And I agree with Alexander on that point.
Any other comments? So we have some clarifications people come back and or that need to be made. I'm sure Eric will appreciate suggestions. Okay, shall we move on?
I think we can.
You're up again, Eric.
Okay, so this is the next draft. This one is the link set draft. So this one was about exposing what is contained in the HTTP link header field as resources. And let's move one slide forward, please. So the model is pretty simple. We just use what the link header field defines as web linking, and then we define two media types for representing the same information that you would find in an HTTP link header field. And one of those uses the same syntax as the header field, so the native HTTP syntax, and the other one uses JSON-based syntax, where we did our best to come up with, on the one hand, a good syntax, and on the other hand, a syntax that also works well with JSON LD, so that for those interested in using a JSON LD context with that JSON structure, it works well with JSON AD, and we had a lot of good help with doing that. The one challenge basically that we have a little bit with this draft is that because of the way how HTTP, the HTTP header field works, it's always clear what the context of those links is. It is the resource that returned those header fields. So that makes it kind of easy. But for what we're doing, it's a little bit more tricky, because if those now are standalone resources that you can store, that you can pass around, that are basically context free, then it becomes a little bit more tricky to establish the context of those links, because there's not this implicit context of an HTTP conversation. And that is one of the issues that we have in open, that we still have as an open issue about the draft, but we can look at that in a bit. If we can move forward one slide, please. Thank you. So just if you're wondering what this is looking like, this is a simple example of such a link set. This is the JSON syntax. So what you see here is basically two links that would be represented in JSON in that case, that originally, or no, might also have been used in an HTTP link header field. In this case, it's a JSON-based resource. And those two links both have actually an explicit anchor that explicitly says where the link is originating. And then one of them uses the next link relation type. The other one uses a URI-based link relation type. And then both of them state the target of the link in those href properties. And again, we just reused what the HTTP link header defines, and therefore we didn't really have that much freedom. But the exact structure of that JSON, once again, is something that we try to make as nicely working with JSON LD as possible. Next slide, please.
Before we move on, Phil, do you want to ask a question on that slide? Or do you want to wait till the end?
Sorry, yes, I'll wait till Eric's finished. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So we have implementations already. One is particularly relevant. So that is a GS1 digital link. So GS1 is the organization that is in charge of basically defining all these nice barcodes that you find on your average supermarket items. And they just released a new standard for how this barcode now becomes a URI. So it becomes a web identity. And then there's also a way how you can ask what kind of information is available for this product. So there's a little protocol around it so that you can, for example, get information. Let's say you ask information about a medication you get from a pharmacy. Then you could get information that says, and here's the information that's available for consumers, and here's the information that's available for doctors, and maybe here's the information that's available for people who have allergies or these kind of things. And this information then gets actually returned in such a link set. So it's a pretty major standard. I'm sure there will be literally billions of those things getting used pretty soon. And they took what we had in December, basically, because, well, that's when they were finishing their standard. and that's where it's being used already. So we're hoping that whatever we end up with, we will not break compatibility with what they have now put into their standard. And then there's another implementation where to be honest, I can't say much about it. This is one where my colleague, my co-author, Herbert van de Sampel, that is something that he's working on. So there it's about scholarly resources. So if you have something like a paper or a book, right, then there's also lots of information around that book. It's like, where was this book cited? Where is it available in the library? Where was it referenced? I don't know, like all this kind of information sets that you have in scholarly communications. And they also use link sets because it's kind of natural to represent this kind of information as a bunch of links that you can then exchange in some protocol. Okay, let's move forward, please. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. So this draft has been around for a little bit longer. We changed the name at some point, and then after the last IETF meeting, IETF 109, we moved it into a working group draft. So it now has been published as first version of a working group draft. We've had 12 versions. It did change a fair bit in the beginning because we did, I would say, experiment a lot with the JSON syntax because of the alignment with JSON LD and so forth. But by and large, I think it's not too bad where we are right now. If you could please click on the issues in that slide. Thank you. So these are the open issues that we have on the issue tracker for this draft. So there are still open issues. One is around this anchor, the question, is it mandatory to always have an anchor in there? How do we deal with this? Do we move away a little bit from being fully aligned with a link header field where you don't need to have an anchor property in there? So that's one of the things we're still discussing. And I think the rest, actually, to be honest, is more like little details of the draft. So it's kind of still stuff that we need to resolve, but it's not really changing a whole lot of functionality in the draft. So from my point of view, I think we mostly have addressed all the big questions. There are still some small ones that we need to resolve. Any input on those, of course, would be very, very welcome. We have, like I said, already implementations out there, and 2 of them are pretty big. So we hope that we won't make any changes that will break those, but we'll see how things are going. So that's the current status from my side.
Okay, so this is Rich. I just want to point out, I just cut and pasted the drafts from the issues from the previous individual draft. None of those bottom 4 are my doing. That's all.
Phil, you had a question.
Yeah, I just thought I'd share with the group why GS1 is finds this so useful. There's a link in the chat you could follow if you like, and you'll see an HTML rendering of a link set. Look at the source to see the actual JSON link set object if you so choose. And as Eric has explained fully, I don't need to repeat it. It's about providing links to other sources of data related to the product that you have. So we're not expecting the IANA link registry to include any of our links to things like here's a product information page or here's where you can buy this thing. So we expect those to be defined in our own namespace, and we're using that full power of representing the languages that something's in or whatever it may be. One thing I'm never quite sure of in this kind of thing is we're using the standard in a way that makes sense to us. I don't expect other people to use it in the same way, and therefore I'm not, for example, raising issues on the issue tracker where I think, you know what, it'd be great if it did it like this, because, well, that's just how I'm using it. So, for example, I know that the idea is that you make an HTTP request with the accept header sent to link set, and you get back the link set. Sorry, that's not how we do it. What we do is we say, if you want the link set, you have to actually ask for it by putting a thing in the query string. And then you get back the link set, and then we use the accept header to determine whether or not you get that link set in the native link header format or the JSON format. We've only implemented one of them so far. We will implement the other one. So we are using those features, we're using those media types, we're using the link set, but we may not be using it exactly as Eric and Herbert have planned. I hope that's not a problem, because as far as I'm concerned, we're implementing the standard and we're very grateful that it's there, and we're planning to continue using it. There's another issue I have. If there's one that that says that the link set has to be its own JSON object, there has to be a JSON object with exactly one thing that is a link set, that's a bit of a limitation. We want to put other stuff in there. We want to be able to add a link set to another JSON object. But again, that's just our implementation. Does it matter that we're doing that? So I'm kind of, wondering where how much this group wants those kind of issues that we have to be issues for the standard. I suspect the answer is they don't need to be, which is the approach I'm taking so far. But if you want us to explore it, then obviously I can raise issues and do it.
Mark, go ahead. We can't hear you though, Mark. Oh, now we can. Yes.
Okay. I'm not up to speed with this draft, but listening to Phil's questions, I would hope that we're not going to try and promote, what are perceived as best practices for things other than this format in this draft. And I would hope that Phil would be able to use the structure here, and that any requirements about what the overall structure is would be about the media type, so he could still use the JSON object in another place, just you wouldn't use the same media type, for example. That would be my sense of the answers to Phil's questions.
Thank you, Mark. That is kind of the approach that we're adopting. Yes, thank you.
Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think there's nothing wrong with what you're doing, Phil. We don't really say anything about how to request those things, right? We just define the media types, so you can use them in any way you like. The only thing is, of course, if you start putting a link set object, so to speak, into your own JSON structure somewhere else, then it's not that media type anymore. But I think that's clear. Other than that, you're of course free to do that, and it might still be useful because you don't have to come up with a new definition of how to represent that particular structure that you're interested in. And it might still be
advantage for us. Yes,
Okay.
That is the key thing for us, Eric. Exactly as you say, having that structure defined in a way that we can refer to normatively in our standards, because we're a standards body as well. I want to be able to refer to this normatively in the GS1 Digital Link Standard and say, do that. And until this is an RFC, I can't.
Okay, yes.
Excellent. I don't see any additional questions in Jabber, so unless anybody has any other thoughts, we can move on.
Okay.
So Sanjay, you're up on problem details.
Yeah, so thanks. This is just an update on this BIS spec. And I'm looking, at Mark and Eric, if I'm wrong somewhere, please chime in. So just, can you go to the next slide? This is just information for people who haven't looked at this slide. I think Mark and Eric were co-authors of this RFC. They started in 2012. I think there are 12 drafts. and RFC in 2016. You go to the next slide. So the motivation for the BIS draft is one of the common use cases that we find when we try to use 7807 is that it treats sending multiple problems in the error in the response of HTTP request as an extension, and so this is the most common case when a new consumer of the API starts using an API. Especially, I have noticed this in the fintech world where the request payload is bit complex for most of the APIs. So they come across this problem most often where they have to, the API developers have to send multiple errors in the response. And the problem details, RFC suggested that you should provide an extension for that. So because of that, what happens is we find proprietary ways of sending the error responses. Second use case I have come across also, and this is while I think I was at PayPal at that time, which is a payout kind of use case where you have to pay to multiple parties in this gig economy. And at that time, you are sending multiple things there, and the errors may be coming from multiple payment transactions, the validation error. So that was the second use case. The working group decided to revise this RFC, and that's a history. In a hindsight, it seems like we had lots of questions on the type member, so it requires more clarification. So that is another area where we would be working on providing clarification. Next slide, please. A bunch of issues. I was not sure that we are going to go through these issues in this meeting. This is the first time I'm attending IETF meeting and presenting also. But just to give you an overview, there are probably 15 issues. We have resolved 2, 4 are editorial issues, and the rest are listed here. As you see, issues related to clarifying what goes in the type member of the problem details JSON is coming up in 4 issues. Discussion is about should it be a relative URI, or not, or should it be a URN, how it should be interpreted. So that requires some clarification, and I'll let, I think Mark has been involved with all those, so maybe he can provide better explanation if I'm missing something. Number 12, problem details object for warning. So we have this another ID that we are discussing in the working group, and this issue was raised. Should we include anything related to warning in the problem details spec? There are a bunch of responses. So all these issues are still open. So if you have any comments on that, please feel free to put your comments there. There are a couple of issues which are number 10 and number 8, where the agreement is once we change the schema, we should provide in appendix the JSON schema for the change with the change problem details object, and also JSON ID context. And the last one is basically the issue which started this effort. So link is at the bottom. I'm not sure we have time to discuss all those issues, but these are the issues in general over there. Next slide, please. There was one issue, and this is the question here, it was about should we have a repository for common problem types. Graham raised that common types. I've given some examples. He also provided some examples, but there could be more. If we have more, then the question is where it should be listed. Mark has given a couple of suggestions, so that's an open issue how to treat it. But I'm not sure, it's part of the work of this RFC, or is it a separate ID is required for that? So that's a question for the group. Next slide, please. Yeah, we're done. Thank you.
I'm not seeing any questions in Jabber, and nobody has added themselves into the queue. So, Mark, go ahead.
So just about the one on the screen, the repository of common problem types. I think it would be interesting to try to have a coordinated community, effort to define common problem types. And excuse me, the difference between these two proposals is, an IANA registry, you would need some sort of process and probably some sort of quality bar for getting into the registry. Whereas if it was something like a wiki, then anybody could just kind of lump in what they like. I think both are viable. I think if we want reuse, maybe having something that tries to encourage convergence would be better, which would mean the first one. But I'd be interested to hear if anybody has any preferences there.
Speaking as an individual, it would be really concerning to me for that not to have a reasonable quality bar. We've seen in APIs that we've worked with, teams go, oh, I don't like 404. I want to say my thing is not found. And then another team says, well, no, my thing is not found. And the types, those further precisions are not really anything that's actionable by the consumer. They are just more descriptive, because this is the way people are used to building APIs, where they come up with an error code for everything. And it has caused a lot of challenges for us to manage those things that don't really add any real extra value. Chris.
And that aligns with my experience too. I mean, I think probably one of the most relevant counterexamples is the what working group uses Wiki to manage their link relations registry still. And they did that because working with IANA registry in the past was really difficult. But we've actually had some pretty good experiences using GitHub to manage IANA registries and to get convergence on new entries. So I think that's probably a good path forward.
Chris, you had something you wanted to add?
Yes, I do think that this would certainly be the most useful if we have a repository of common problem types to encourage reuse. I think that will allow clients who receive these to potentially take common actions on them, to make decisions about what's going on. I can see a lot of value in that, as long as the problem types are well specified, meet reasonable bars, and IANA has processes for all these.
But then how do you differentiate between a reusable failure code and a new HTTP 4XX status code? What's the bar?
Right. So we have status codes for certain categories of thing, right? But the problem details are going to be more granular than that, right? So you might have 404 not found, and you might have the problem was that, oh, now I'm trying to make up API things on the fly. That's not going to go well. But your problem may be more specific than that, but still more general than there was a problem locating it in my particular application directory.
This is Rich. Let me, for the benefit of some members, let me just mention how the registries work. There are a couple. There's an RFC. The number escapes me that describes them, but IANA, the Assigned Numbers Authority, maintains a text file or a series of text files that list different things such as the MIME type, such as DNS and DNS entry types, and so on. The working group can create any registry it wants or ask in what's called the IANA considerations section of an RFC. And it's up to the working group. Again, it has to go through AD, IESG, and IETF approval. Can say, oh, we want this to be first come, first serve, meaning the first person to claim the not found error problem gets to use it. There are increasing levels of specificity and correctness required. A common one is the most strict being the only thing you can put in a registry is something that is documented in a standards track RFC. So that takes a long time. A step down from that is it must be documented. Typically that means written as an internet draft, since those always last forever. And midway between those two is it must be documented and it must be reviewed by a couple of designated experts. And they can push back and say, no, this is too loose. This doesn't seem like something, you can't get the not found error for the case where one parameter of the method of the API is not found. So those kinds of things. So you get a review. It's certainly possible to create a registry. As I said, meets anything along that scale. The experts would be recommended by Francesca and appointed by the IESG. Okay, so that's background. With no hats, speaking not as a chair, I prefer a registry because wikis and their mutability and lack of permanence bother me. In particular, if I'm going to start to encode common semantics in something, I really don't want it to change without some process for it to change, as opposed to someone just edits something in a SNIT.
We know that your fame and fortune comes from being an IANA registry expert.
Pardon me? I know you're joking.
Julian made the comment that being the designated expert for an IANA registry is really popular, and that is indeed the source of most of his fame and fortune. So.
Yeah. Okay. Disclaimer: I am one of the 3 experts for all of the TLS registries, so I have experience.
So I think Sanjay and Eric and I can take that feedback and try and come up with a proposal for this. That's really useful, actually. Could you go back to the previous slide, actually?
And Sanjay has a hand.
On this.
Oh,
can I ask a question on this? So, for the registry, it seems like the updates to it. If you want to add something or you want to change something, there is a process involved. But what does the group think about providing an API to retrieve the common types from the registry? Is the registry providing the API so that, for example, if you want to include those common problem types in the API portal, you would be able to do that by using that API.
Yeah.
The reason that the current RFC 7807 cautions so strongly against automatically retrieving a problem type URI is because of an experience that the W3C has had with the DTDs for XML. They have a significant load problem across their servers now spanning a couple of decades because people automatically retrieve the DTDs and some other artifacts from their servers. So I'd be really wary of setting up something where the IETF were running a critical piece of infrastructure that people were using to get information at runtime. If we can design it so that it's something that they get offline, that might work. But that to me seems more like it's a static repository, much like the registries work now, rather than something with an API around it. That's just my initial reaction.
I see.
Yeah. Although Mark and I work for companies that can ameliorate that problem, but the bigger concern is that any published RFC or the appropriate published RFC can change the schema of the registry, which means that fetching it and looking through it and its description, most of which are intended to be human understandable, it's probably not going to be as useful as you might think.
Thanks.
So on this slide, the multiple problems issue, I'm thinking we should go away and come up with a proposal for that. And if I remember correctly, the kind of what we were talking about in the issue was either I don't think do nothing is an option just because this has come up so often. We can certainly introduce some examples describing how you would handle multiple problems in an extension or in your type definition. And that might, just doing it by example might help, or by defining a few. And if we can maybe toy with trying to come up with a way to convey multiple problems as long as they share the same status code semantics, what I think someone referred to as facets. So I guess we can work on some proposals and bring those to the group and see how that goes. And the other ones here, the type-related issues are probably the deepest issues we face, in that we have to make a decision whether or not we're going to make a backwards incompatible change to the format. If we want to, do something like say that it's never a relative URI, it can be a short token string that is a registered string or something, like link relations does. We could do that, but that would be a backwards incompatible change, and so we should probably introduce a new media type for the format. And then the question is that really improving things when we now have two different problem media types? And that's kind of the nature of the discussion. My reading of the current discussion is that people are wary of introducing a new media type, and so we probably need to work within the constraints of refining what's there and making it more approachable for developers. But if folks have feedback on that, that'd be really helpful.
Sanjay?
I realize that my hand was raised. I don't have feedback on that.
I guess Sanjay and Eric and I will work on some potential proposals and see if we can close some of those issues then.
Sanjay?
So, want to know what the group thinks about inclusion of the warning into problem details. I think we have brief discussion on the issue, but if I just want to raise it here, what is the thinking about that? to include in the problem details.
Go ahead, Eric.
Just briefly pitching in. So the warning draft, which still is an individual submission, right? So that one kind of has stalled a little bit. I think if we are revising the problem details, it definitely would be a good idea to think about whether both of these could go in there. And I think we did realize for the warning draft that we published a little while ago that if we removed some of the things that people weren't so happy about, that actually there would be that much left, other than saying that this structure can be embedded in places, and then you can kind of combine the warning information with other information that you're serving. But I think if that is something that we want to add to the problem details, then I think we would need to think about how to best do that, because at that point, right, the response is not necessarily an error response anymore. We use the same structure to serve in a success response with embedded warning information, which would be pretty different from the model that the problem detail had so far.
Chris?
Yeah, it's not clear to me why warnings are just not slightly less severe problems. All the same logic that we have around problems seem to apply well for warnings. And I see no compelling reason that a problem couldn't be returned as the result of a successful operation.
Speaking as an individual, my understanding was there are some scenarios where there is a desired response payload that it's basically a partial success. That here's a bunch of results that we got, but there were some issues, so you might not have the complete set of results that you were expecting. And that was what I understood
Pretty much
Andre's proposal to address.
So yeah. So I mean, what Andre started, right, with pretty much just what you said. So it was the proposal to say that the general structure of that problem detail object is useful, but I also want to be able to embed it in a response that, so to speak, mostly is success, but does have some stuff in there that might be interesting to look at. And in that case, you could just embed that the same object, but it would be a successful response and not an error code. But that was also because when the warning draft was started, right, we didn't have the revision of the problem detail draft already on the table. So I think there is definitely an opportunity to align things here.
Mark, you want to add something?
The case, then I think it's very easable. This is very similar to the last discussion we had about we can make this object embeddable in other formats. Just you wouldn't use the same media type, and that's fine. I think we can do that in this pretty easily.
I think I commented on that issue. One of the things which I find, when you are looking at warning, right, as a consumer of the API, would you be looking for warning with a 400 or 4xx or 5xx class of status code? My observation is that you probably would not. And what I looked in the warnings draft was specifically, as Eric was saying, that it's a success, but there are some warnings. So that's where it is conflicting, in my opinion, that in problem details, we specifically say, I guess, that 4xx and 5xx class of problems. We don't talk about 2xx kind of status code there, right? Unless I'm reading something wrong, I thought that was the conflicting part. How do you include warning in problem details and still convey that warning with 400 or 500 class of error status code? Thoughts?
Well, I'll let Chris has his hand up first.
The proposal in the warning draft is to use a success response code in most cases, 2XX, and then to have a specific header field, some kind of warning header field, not warning because that one's taken, but a different one, but a header field that would signal that there was something not wrong, but something that might take some consideration. And then that might be interesting to look at, and that would be represented by embedding that problem detail object. And then I think we got questions that said, yes, but what is that header field then good for? What can intermediaries do with it? And I think that's a valid question. You could still say, well, it's maybe something that you along the way you want to log, you want to analyze, you want to say, oh, there's a lot of warnings happening. Let's look into that. But that's, I don't know whether that's a good enough response, but that's kind of the place I think where we are right now.
Chris, go ahead. Do you want to answer that, Eric?
So Mark already said that right in the chat. So the warning header itself is deprecated. So initially, I think we thought of piggybacking on that, and then we were told, no, this is going away. So the warning draft introduced a new header field, which is kind of similar, so to speak, right? But it's not called warning. I'm blanking right now what it's called. I don't know, something, warning something.
It was content warning, I think.
There you go. Yeah, okay, thanks, Daryl. And that warning header then basically surfaces the information that that response is success, but there is something in there that is not, so to speak, a full success. So anybody interested might want to look into this, and then that's kind of the general mechanics of the warning graph.
But the content warning header wasn't proposed to actually contain details about the warning. There was an expectation that the warnings would be embedded into the response to provide some context as to where that warning was relevant within the returned payload.
Right. And I
was to
I'm
use
still I think we had this discussion. I'm still at the place where I don't understand why the header adds any value, because usually when you add a header, it's for somebody who's not going to process the body. It's for generic HTTP software or an intermediary or something. Or it's because something doesn't fit into the body. But if we're going to put the data in the body, I think what the header really is in this case is I really mean it, you need to examine this body. And I really mean it headers, and I really mean it protocol elements. I'm not a big believer in those. I think that, the recipient, they need to parse the body and understand the body, even if it is successful. And you can write in your format, that the successful response contains this thing. There might be warnings in it, so be aware of that. And developers should read the documentation. I don't think that adding a header really helps anything, unless there's some use case that we haven't talked about.
And so just as a question, Chris, Mark, sorry. If the proposal was to add actual content in the header that described what the problem was, so that, for example, you could return a warning related to something that wasn't easy to embed, like I'm returning an image, but I want to return signal some kind of additional warning metadata about that content, would that be a more valuable scenario in your mind?
Valuable is a big word. plausible, maybe.
Would you have less objections?
Sure, I can see it. I think there would be some complications in that, but yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I think I would understand it a little bit better, quite a bit better. I can see I can picture situations where the object you return doesn't easily contain some sort of warnings. And I think if it does, if you're returning a JSON object from an API, that's delightful. Just put your stuff in there and, like Mark said, read the documentation. But if you're returning an image, returning a link set, maybe you have a warning that says this link set is truncated. I was only able to give you some of the things. Again, I'm thinking up things on the fly here, so maybe they're not good examples. But having the actual problem in the header itself does feel like it probably addresses some use cases.
Okay, I think that's good feedback to provide to to Andre. Cool. Were there any other issues that people wanted to bring up on this HTTP biz problem? Mark?
Working it. Yeah, just to conclude that, is this something we'd be interested in doing this draft? Because if we're going to have a header that says how to express these things, then probably we need some pretty tight coupling between the format and the header. So is this something we should try and do, I guess? Against it. I'm just, it's more work. So.
I mean, is that a question that we should defer to the list? So considering Andre, the author of the editor of the doc, is not here?
Need to sketch out what it looks like to make sure that we're, able to actually do it. So yeah, that's good. That's a good point.
Let's take it to the list. Okay, so I think that closes this issue, and I think we basically have already had the conversation on the next item on the agenda. So Rich, do you want to pull up the final topic here, and I shall take off my chair hat and put on my fireproof outfit, as I suspect this will be fairly controversial. This is a proposal to see how much support interest there is in this idea. I see some signs of there being value here, and I shall take you through the story. So if you want to go to the next slide. So APIs generally, for the large amount of cases, use JSON as their format. And JSON very wisely chose a very limited set of primitive data formats. APIs are describing all kinds of much more richer semantics, and people regularly want to introduce those semantics, but currently they're just kind of conveyed out of band, and the client figures out, oh, well, when you put those series of characters in that property, this is how I go interpret it. If you go to the next slide. There are additional efforts to add more semantics. If you look at JSON schema format, which again is used in a lot of APIs, they went a little bit further and they distinguish between a number and an integer. Go to the next slide. In our OpenAPI specification to describe HTTP APIs, initially we took the type and the format property in JSON schema and extended that even further. So now we can differentiate between integer and longs and floats and doubles, because what tends to happen is these APIs are sending payloads that then get consumed by people using programming languages, and we are mapping to those types of those programming languages, and we start to get a little bit further into programming languages types with things like date and date time, and then odd cases like password. Next slide. Some API specs went even further, and there's geography type semantics in there and geometry type semantics that get added. So there's all these new primitives that have got defined specific to a particular spec that is a set of conventions around creating an API. Go to the next slide, please. GraphQL is very popular in the API world, and they kind of went the other way. They said, yeah, we're going to be really simple, and we'll just stick with, okay, we'll differentiate between ints and floats, and we'll have strings and boolean, and then we'll have this special thing, ID, because that has some special semantics. But when it comes to a date, the serialization of that is kind of left to the reader. So there's just a lot of ambiguity here. Okay, keep going. Next slide, please. You can go further, and people have started to try and define further repositories, catalogs of types, because everybody's API has an address, and so therefore, why not define standards for country codes? And well, country codes, there's 2-letter abbreviations and there's 3-character abbreviations. So people are trying to standardize those. Next slide, please. And then it goes beyond just primitives. This is taken out of gRPC and their JSON serialization. When it comes to the serialization of their duration type, it has 2 what they call fields, which in JSON get serialized as properties. One, which is seconds, and then nanoseconds. And in the specs that we're looking at, we've sort of seen the same thing. If you go to the next slide. We saw earlier link set, and link set has a serialization of how to render a link in a JSON document. But we also, earlier on in this, when this working group started up, we had a proposal for a different serialization of what a link could look like. And in that case, it used the rel as a property in the JSON object as opposed to a map key. And so it's not so simple as saying, well, we should just have one standardized way of formatting these things, because there isn't just one. And sometimes the serialization format on the right makes more sense. Sometimes the serialization on the left makes more sense. And so next slide. This is really the question that I'm asking, is there a place, is there value in creating a serialization registry for JSON types, both primitives and complex types, where we can give a globally unique identifier and then reference a specification that defines what the shape of that JSON fragment is? And there are questions like, is this just defining syntax? Can we define additional semantics? Should this registry enforce some standardized schema format? Do we pick a winner in JSON schema formats, or do we let people just choose whatever they want within the spec? And just go to the next slide. I'll make my pitch. I think this would be valuable because we have lots of people who just keep reinventing the same thing, and then we have efforts to try and pick a winner. as to which is the right one so that people will adopt it. APIs, unfortunately, in many cases, they are not self-descriptive. Many APIs just return application/JSON and embed a whole bunch of semantics in there. And so if we could start standardizing at that primitive level, at least what the set of characters are that make up a date or a country code or whatever geometry, a geocoordinate, are we helping the situation is really the question. And if we did this, I believe we could improve interop and build more generic tooling in order to make it easier to consume APIs without subtle serialization bugs creeping in. And with that, my pitch is over, and I hope somebody has comments and thoughts. So I just scrolled in the Jabber chat, and the first thing I see is Mark saying, "Run away." Okay, I'm seeing suggestions of this is the wrong working group. Julian, do you want to elaborate? What is the right working group? Okay, separate mailing list. That's just so that you don't have to hear the conversations. I see a comment from Chris about, can we just map seaboard tags? Isn't that just like picking a winner though? And that, go ahead, Chris.
I don't know. Maybe it's a good winner.
We have traditionally been unsuccessful in convincing everybody to have the same opinion on who is a winner. It may be a good winner, but are we going to be able to convince everybody that it's a good winner?
I mean, as a practical matter, there are all sorts of different design concerns that people have when they design seaboard tags that are different in JSON. So no, you can't actually straight up map them. But it's basically the same sort of problem.
What is the status of JSON schema? A draft was proposed. Anyone know?
There are some drafts, yes. There's has been conversations about what the right working group is. Some people asked about whether it should be in our working group, and I believe the suggestion was no, it would make more sense in the JSON working group. There are a number of people actively working on those specifications, those drafts.
Yeah, so the context I have is there was Acme is a JSON-based protocol for doing certificate management and creation, and an extension came up to do it for third parties where you get the certificate and a key, but it goes to the CDN that acts on your behalf, that kind of thing. And they defined a whole bunch of JSON request stuff, and they had to redefine it in CBOR CDDL because there was no JSON schema yet, which just mind-blowing. So I wonder, I saw in the Jabber thread there was, oh, this is XML schema part 2 for the data types. And I know that's, for most people, a red flag warning, run away. But I wonder if it makes sense to put this wherever JSON schema ends up?
The thing is, though, JSON schema isn't defining really any semantics. JSON schema is a validation language. It just says when you come across a property name that is called this, then here are the rules that you apply to that. It isn't. This. I see that it is a distinct set of problems. And Ulysses asked, what is an example beyond link set? And like it comes down to, if somebody defined a JSON payload and decided to use like the ISO format for date, there's no standardized way that is machine readable to say, I picked the ISO standard for date in order to communicate what those set of characters are going to look like. There's no, when I specify duration, there's, how did I specify the set of characters that define what the value is for that duration? There is no one way that anybody who's building a media type or some kind of protocol on top of HTTP can, in a globally unique way, this is the particular serialization that goes between those two open quotes, close quotes values.
Okay.
Okay. I'm not seeing a lot of enthusiasm. I'm seeing a lot of fear. And Mark suggested we take this to the list. So. Take to dispatch? Because. Go ahead, Chris.
So the questions I ask when I'm trying to determine whether something should be worked on as a standard is it useful, and do different parties need to agree on it? And I think you've clearly hit both hurdles here, and especially demonstrated that we have half a dozen competing standards, and so clearly we should have another one. And so I do think there's definitely work here. The question is then, do we have enough agreement to do it? And is the problem well enough specified? And is now the appropriate time? And I don't know that I have the answers to all of those questions.
Yeah, and I would argue that this isn't a proposal to create another standard. This is a proposal to allow all of those existing standards to have a standardized way of identifying JSON structures that are defined within their standard. Like JSON schema, for example, has this property called format, which is very specifically an identifier that provides additional semantics over and above the JSON type. And it is intended to address this particular problem, the fact that JSON itself doesn't provide any additional semantics other than those basic primitives. The thing is that format value, the range, there is no range of values that you can use in that format. It's just a string that anybody can make up, and hopefully people will adopt a common set of strings. And I'm like, if you look at some of the other examples that I gave, it's like every spec comes along and wants to give some kind of identifier to this kind of type, and or this kind of shape of data, and I'm suggesting that we create a repository of those identifiers, which could be used by any of the existing standards or future standards.
Right. Yeah, I think I understand that. That does make sense, and I can see a lot of places where it would be useful. You could have common library implementations. there's definitely a lot of utility to it. There's still questions about whether there's a lot of agreement about it.
Yeah, actually, the biggest comment that came up that I was sort of surprised at is the fact that folks don't feel that this is the right working group to do this, which is really interesting, because I see this is one thing that HTTP APIs are very dependent on. But it's good feedback. I don't know whether I missed any other comments. If somebody had other comments in the chat that I didn't pick up on, please feel free to come to the mic.
The only one I'll relay, Mark Nottingham's going to bed, but he thinks this is interesting and looks forward to seeing discussion on the list. And I think that's probably the best place for it for now.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, well, first IETF 109, we needed more time, and now we have extra time. We'll get it right next time.
All right. Normally at the last session of the last day, we'd say everyone have safe travels home, but maybe that just means walk across the hall or upstairs or something. So don't slip and fall as you walk from one home office to another. Thank you very much, people. This is really interesting and worthwhile. I think we made a lot of good progress and look forward to seeing some stuff on the list.
Thanks very much, and thanks to everybody who presented.
Yes, thank you very much. All right, bye.
Bye, folks.